In 2020, the murder of George Floyd sparked protests against police brutality across the United States. One of the protests that caught a lot of national attention was the Capitol Hill Occupy protest. What makes this protest particularly interesting was the way that they were able to avoid surveillance. So this presentation, brought to you by me, Delaney, Ennis, is about specifically the Capitol Hill Occupy protest, or CHOP as I'll shorten it to throughout this presentation, and the relationship of sousveillance, which is countering surveillance in a way to take power back from those who are currently the watchers, so to speak. I do want to start this off with content warnings for police brutality and racism, including descriptions of the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and the attack on Rodney King. So please keep that in mind and take care of yourself as we go through this presentation. Today, I will be talking to you about the relationship of Black Lives Matter and the Capitol Hill Occupy protest, as well as the way those came to be, the context in which they were written, alongside a quick summary of some basic surveillance and surveillance rhetoric theory. Further, we'll be applying that theory to the Capitol Hill Occupy protest and talking about how it was successful and unsuccessful in avoiding surveillance. Let's start with a little introduction. The research question I'm exploring today is, to what extent did the Capitol Hill Occupy protest successfully avoid and counter surveillance? So I chose specifically Seattle because the Capitol Hill Occupy protest was such a fascinating phenomenon that happened. And so it's interesting to see how they avoided surveillance, especially in a city like Seattle, because Seattle is a hub to a ton of tech giants like Amazon, like Boeing, like Microsoft, that have a lot of surveillance embedded into the infrastructure of the city itself. It's become somewhat of a lab to grow these technologies. So if a city like Seattle is able to avoid those, this is likely applicable to cities across the United States and even across borders altogether. The implications of this research are thinking of how we can take what I am reflecting on here in terms of Capitol Hill Occupy protests and surveillance. How can we apply that to further protests that will happen inevitably in the future? So it's really important to learn from how people had successes and failures in protests, moving backwards, looking backwards so they can understand what we're doing in the future. It's probably important to go over what is surveillance. Surveillance stems from an early theory in 1998 by theorist Steve Mance. He proposes in 1998 reflectionism, which is this idea of countering the way that you are being surveyed. So this is the idea of putting up a mirror to these different people, these different organizations, to say, look at what you're doing, look at how you're treating me. He furthers this theory post 9/11 in 2003, and he talks about sousveillance. Surveillance is a term that specifically means taking the power dynamic away by acting reflectionism. So that is by recording a camera, or making sure that people who are used as surveillance, such as police, are held accountable in that same way. So it is able to disrupt these barriers that are put up that by these positions of power. And finally, dark surveillance was proposed by Simone Brown in 2014, which is a theory that centers Black bodies in surveillance. A lot of the things that Steve Mann described as potential acts of surveillance are not applicable to brown bodies, as they are held to a higher scrutiny in terms of policing and countering surveillance. So dark surveillance specifically operates on the ways that surveillance does not pick up Black bodies, in the way that facial recognition softwares don't recognize Black bodies. And it's a way of acting in the shadows, so to speak, a way of diving around and finding ways to help others in community and solidarity, while also being able to disrupt systems of power. Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd in late May 2020, and this sparked a ton of reaction from the United States in terms of anti-police brutality protests across the United States centered around Black Lives Matter. The protest in Seattle was particularly violent in terms of police releasing tear gas and flashbangs on the protesters. So it became a very contentious area. The Seattle Police Department's East Precinct eventually had to be boarded up and left behind so they could go focus on other areas of the city. And so that made that area in Capitol Hill to be particularly just cop-free. So the protesters used the space then to work on getting food, work on making posters, getting medical attention if needed. So this was a space to really regroup, and originally it was called the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, but quickly got renamed to Capitol Hill Occupied Protest because people weren't treating it as a protest. They were more treating it as a music festival or someplace to hang out. So they really wanted to center that idea of protest. This started on June 8th, 2020, but shortly ended by July 1st, 2020, after hearing cases of assault come forward from the space. So the mayor sent in police to shut down the whole operation and tear it apart. So that is how CHOP came to rise and fall, and there's a lot that we're going to be able to learn from that. So on to the analysis. I have 4 subsections here talking about metadata, surveillance cameras, politics of space, and pitfalls that we'll be going through about the Capitol Hill Occupy protest. Let's start with one of the most prevalent forms of surveillance in the 21st century, which is metadata. Metadata is data about data. So your phone is collecting all sorts of different types of data. Whenever you send a text, whenever you post a message, anything to that effect is going to collect data about you. And that larger aggregate data is able to make more assumptions about you, the decisions you'll make, and often companies like Facebook or Instagram will sell that data to different companies so that they can better target you and market towards your specific wants and needs. However, an application that does not do that is Signal, which is funded by people who use the application. So that space does not collect the same metadata that other applications would. So Seattle protesters use Signal to specifically organize with one another in a way that they wouldn't be tracked, because as the first Black Lives Matter organizers in 2014 were heavily tracked and surveyed on Twitter. And so finding that way to be able to communicate without having to give away all of this information about yourself and remain anonymous was a phenomenal way that they were able to organize and keep the protests going. However, one of the biggest downfalls of countering the surveillance that they were doing was the people who were treating the protest as if it was a music festival. So like this picture over here says, "This is no Coachella." So it's trying to remind people that this is not a place that you come and take photos, because there were a lot of people who were treating it like a place that they could take pictures to virtue signal to their friends that, oh, I'm doing the right thing. But in the meantime, they're taking photos of people and putting them in potential danger of being arrested or worse, like any sort of various types of scrutiny they could be put under based upon their faces being associated with Capitol Hill occupied protests. So remaining that anonymity is so important, because the metadata can track your face and your facial recognition software that's alongside with that. It can track where your phone is. And so it was really important the ways that they were able to counter this surveillance through the technological sphere. Let's talk about surveillance cameras. Surveillance cameras are often the big thing you think of when you think of surveillance. You think of someone having a camera posted up, staring at you. Surveillance cameras are extremely dangerous in terms of protests due to facial recognition software. The surveillance camera's invisibility of protests, though, is really important because the Capitol Hill Occupy protests intentionally took down cameras. One of their main goals of the protests were to make sure that these people who were protesting would not have to be punished in any sort of way. So that was one of the main demands that they had, alongside, of course, decreasing police budget by 50% and reallocating those funds to historically Black and Indigenous communities. With all of that in mind, it was really important to make sure that they didn't allow cameras in that space, which was really circumvented by quite a few of these people who are taking those pictures for social media. Again, there are over 1,000 photos on Instagram tagged as CHOP or the Capitol Hill Occupied protest. Really informs how people are going to be seeing the protest itself, and informs who they're seeing in the protest. And it doesn't enable that anonymity that is so essential to protests. So it's really important that they took away those cameras, though the circumvention still came through by allowing journalists and just anyone on in to take photos of that space. One of the most surveillant practices that CHOP put forward was containing their space. So the politics of space are very complicated, considering this is a physical location that they were able to commandeer. One of the biggest concerns was having people like Proud Boys or police to be able to come into the space and disrupt it and hurt people and do any of the terrible things that could potentially happen from that. So they had people on the outside guarding it, which completely co-aligns with the ideas of surveillance that Steve Mann put forward. These people are looking at the same people who are policing the set area and holding up borders, while they are doing the same thing and letting those people know they are not allowed in. So this type of countering the surveillance practices that were already happening in the protest is incredibly surveillant in nature. So it is really important to look at how they avoided these types of surveillance in terms of not surveilling one another. They're not feeling for the state. They're not going in to be a covalent situation where they are surveying their neighbors. It's rather that they worked in unity to make sure that they were all safe in that space. There are a lot of pitfalls, opportunities to learn and grow from based upon what happened at the Capitol Hill Occupy protest. A lot of concern was around safety. So that is a concern that comes up often when talking about surveillance and anti-surveillance rhetoric, is like, how do people remain safe? And that was one of the biggest pitfalls, and that's what eventually led to CHOP dissolving. The lack of organization made this space a place that people were not able to be held accountable for taking care of one another, which is frankly in the structure that they brought forward, to not have a single person associated with it and a single person responsible, rather than it's not that the responsibility goes on no one, it's that now the responsibility is shouldered on everyone. And I think that sort of practice is really important to pay attention to, that you are not being covalent in that you are surveying your neighbors, you're surveying the people you're protesting with. No, you should be covalent in the sense of you're not watching for the state, you are watching to take care of one another and work in solidarity. So that lack of communication is really essential reason to why CHOP dissolved. So moving forward with further protests that will inevitably happen, it's important to pay attention to how are you making sure that the people around you are safe and taken care of while protesting. And so keeping that in mind, it's important to pay attention to these forms of rhetoric if you want to be able to effectively go forward with surveillance practices. In conclusion, there was a number of ways in which surveillance was enacted. This was in terms of politics of visibility, in terms of talking how social media was surveyed, in terms of website surveillance, in terms of video camera surveillance, in terms of occupying space that was not necessarily to be seen by others. I think that a lot of this comes down to, why are people doing this? Why are they going into this, putting themselves on the line to take care of it? Because it's a cause they believe in, it's a cause that they care about. So moving forward, it's really essential to understand these ways that they fell apart was because they were not united under that one that one idea of taking care of one another, this idea of empathy. In terms of surveillance circumvention, it's this idea of making sure that we are holding one another accountable, and this idea of community in which why it fell apart. With that in mind, here are the works cited that I have referenced explicitly in this video, but I have even more works cited in the essay that I have in a hyperlink below this video. So I would love to take any and all questions you may have. Please comment them below, or you can email me at ennisds@plu.edu. I would be ecstatic to talk to you about this topic. Thank you.